quorum yetu kwa wale ambao tulikuwa pamoja, nilikuwepo mimi kama mwenyekiti, alikuwepo Constantine Talemwa, makamu mwenyekiti kutoka Mwanza, wanachama wetu pia, Advocate Beatus Malima, na katika quorum hii tuliwamisi members wawili ambao ni wakili na Kazairi Lukiotenga na wakili Mary Munisi. Huyu ni wa Dodoma, Lukiotenga ni wa hapa, alitoa udhuru na tuliupokea. Naomba nisome uamuzi. On the 2nd of February 2023, Tanganyika Law Society, sorry, Nkuba unawakilishwa leo, you're alone. Lile file letu liko wapi? Ningetegemea tungelikuta hapa ili turekodi. Utarekodi So, on the 2nd of February 2023, Tanganyika Law Society Electoral Committee, the Electoral Committee issued a public notice of the Tanganyika Law Society general elections through a TLS official email and 1-inch newspaper. The notice invited qualified candidates to vie for various positions within the Tanganyika Law Society and TLS following the expiry of tenure of the current leadership. The notice period was set effective from 2nd of February 2023 up to 3rd of March 2023. On the 21st of February 2023, Advocate Sweetbert Nkuba, the nominee, submitted his nomination form to contest for the position of the President of the Tanganyika Law Society. In compliance with Regulation 28, Sub-Rule 2 of the Tanganyika Law Society Elections Regulations 2022, on the 8th of March 2023, the Electoral Committee invited members of TLS to submit any objections or information in confidence on ethics and malpractices against any nominee to satisfy itself that the candidate meets the qualifications set by the regulations. Following invitation by Electoral Committee on the 9th of March 2023, Advocate George Anyuisisye submitted to the committee a notice of objections against Advocate Sweetbert Nkuba on the grounds that the candidate has not been practicing for the past 10 years as required by law, and further that he is a public servant, hence ineligible to vie for the position of the President of TLS. On the 18th of March 2023, the Electoral Committee considered the objections and, in presence of the nominee and absence of the objector, directed the nominee to produce evidence that he is not a public servant, not later than 20th of March 2023 at 10:30 a.m. Strangely, and while promising to do so, the nominee failed or neglected to produce, hence not meeting the deadline. However, at 12:30 p.m. on 20th of March 2023, the nominee sent a letter to the Secretariat of the Electoral Committee notifying the committee that he cannot get hold of the said documents which were required as proof since he has moved into different houses during his office exit process. On the same 20th of March 2023 at around 2:30 p.m., the Electoral Committee deliberated and determined that the nominee is not eligible to contest the position of the President of Tanganyika Law Society on his failure to satisfy the committee that he was not a public servant, contrary to Regulation 13, Sub-E of the regulations, and further that he has not been in practice for the past 10 years. It is with this background that the nominee is aggrieved and has appealed to this Electoral Appeals Committee. The Memorandum of Appeal was presented to the Secretariat on the 24th of March 2023 by an email registered at 9:34 p.m. a Friday night late after office working hours. The Secretary of the committee read it on Monday, the 26th of March, long after the campaigns for elections had been opened. The appeal was submitted containing 6 grounds of appeal. The committee had the appeal on the 29th of March 2023 in presence of the appellant, represented by Advocates Alois Rugazia and Jeremiah Mtobesia, while Advocate Ferdinand Makore entered appearance on behalf of Advocate George Anyosisia, the objector. Before the commencement of the hearing of the appeal, the committee asked the parties to address it on whether it was appropriate or not for Advocate Ferdinand Makore to participate in these proceedings in light of Regulations 28 sub Rule 2 of the regulations. The committee did so on the grounds that the objector did not participate in the proceedings before the Electoral Committee, and that in terms of Regulations 28 sub Rule 2 of the regulations, the right to be heard is granted to the nominee, not to the person making the objection. Moreover, the regulation stipulates that the objections or information are given in confidence to the committee. After hearing the parties, the committee ruled that the objector had no right to participate in the appeal of the proceedings. The reason, however, were reserved to be reflected in this substantive ruling. In his submissions, Advocate Alois Rugazia submitted that the objector was not represented before the committee and therefore cannot be represented during the appeal. In reply, Advocate Ferdinand Makore submitted that since the objector presented objection against the nominee in terms of Regulations 28 sub 2 of the regulation, he is entitled to participate in the appeal proceedings even though both did not appear before the Electoral Committee. The committee is of a firm and considered view that the proviso of Regulations 28 sub 2 of the regulations accord the right to be heard to the nominee alone, but not to the person opposing the nomination. Once the objector has given the information and at times in confidence to the committee is directed not to act on that information unless the nominee is heard. There is as such no right of a person giving any information or making the objection to the objection to appear or take part in the proceedings before the committee. That being the case, it follows therefore that the objector cannot appear at the appellate stage, neither himself nor his representative, since he did not appear during hearing. It was on that ground that the committee decided that the objector cannot take part in these appeal proceedings. Now back to the appeal. The first ground of appeal is that the Electoral Committee was improperly constituted contrary to Regulation 4 and 21 sub 2 of the regulations, hence incompetent. It is Council's further submission that according to Regulation 4 sub 1c of the regulations, one of the members of the Electoral Committee is the chairperson of the Ethics Committee of the Society. However, and in terms of Regulations 21 sub Rule 2 of the regulations, such person must be a judge or retired judge, which the current chairperson of the Ethics Committee is not a judge and has never been one. It is the considered opinion of this committee that this issue was not raised before the Electoral Committee and therefore it cannot constitute a ground of appeal at this appellate stage. The committee's hands are tied, considering being limited to hearing appeals only from the Electoral Committee and not to determine the propriety of how the committee is constituted. It is our firm view that therefore it is not within this committee mandate or competence to determine how properly or otherwise is the Electoral Committee constituted. This ground therefore fails. The second ground of appeal is that the Electoral Committee shifted the burden of proof from the objector to the nominee. It is Council's Rugazia's submissions that the objector presented no document before it substantiates that the nominee was a public servant. But strangely, the Electoral Committee shifted this burden to the nominee for proof that he was not a public servant. He cited Section 112 of the Evidence Act, Cap 6, revised edition of 2019, to buttress his position. The committee rejects this ground of appeal on two reasons. First, that the burden of proof never shifted from the nominee For it is the requirement of Regulation 13 sub E of the regulations that a candidate must show that they are not public servants. This presupposes that on submission of the nomination forms, the candidate must show proof of not being a public servant. That being the position, it is clear therefore that with or without information from the objector, the committee on its own has had a legal right to inquire with satisfaction as to whether or not the candidate is not a public servant. When the committee asked the candidate to prove that he was not a public servant, the committee was doing so in his favor with a view of clearing the position that has been alleged. The candidate cannot therefore argue that the committee shielded the burden of proof since right from the beginning, it was the nominee's obligation to show that he is not a public servant as alleged by the objector. Secondly, it is the opinion of this committee that in light of Regulations 28 sub 2 of the regulations, it is within the powers of the committee to receive any objection or information from membership in confidence. Once that information is afforded, the committee is entitled to use it as it deems fit and right, only that it cannot act upon it without hearing the nominee and in full. That being the case, it is clear that the committee would not have called the objector to give or produce documents before the committee to prove that the nominee is a public servant. The readings in Regulations 28 sub 2 is clear that the moment the committee asked the nominee to show that he was not a public servant, the committee was not shifting that burden of proof, but rather and simply meeting its obligation under Regulation 13 sub E. The burden of proof did not shift, and the nominee failed to discharge it, and this ground similarly fails. On the third, fifth, and sixth ground were argued jointly by Advocate Mtobesia Jeremiah that the Electoral Committee became ambulant and prosecutor, respectively, for making a decision based on rumors and unproven allegations, since the objector did not appear to prosecute his case against the nominee. The fifth ground is that the committee erred to hold that the nominee was a public servant at the time of submitting his nomination forms. Councillor Mtobesia argued further that prior to applying for presidential candidacy, the nominee was a public servant, but he had tendered a 24 hours notice of resignation on the 19th of February 2023 and submitted his nomination forms on the 21st of February 2023. However, the employer's conditional release was issued by a letter dated the 27th of February 2023 as evidence from their response. Councillor Mtobesia submitted that it was uncalled for the committee to satisfy itself if the nominee is no longer a public servant, simply because the employer released letter was conditional. He maintained that immediately when the 24 hours notice was issued, it was conclusive proof that he was no longer a public servant. He cited Section 35 of the Public Service Act and Public Service Standing Orders 2009, 3rd edition, Order F, capital, Note 4.9.4 and 4.9.5, as he brought members to the difference between resignation and exit, which, to his understanding, the 24 hours notice was sufficient, notwithstanding the subsequent exit processes which followed soon thereafter. The committee is of a view that the third ground is misconceived. It is our considered view that the Electoral Committee did not become ambulatory or prosecutor by seeking proof from the nominee that he was not a public servant, as we have already shown that it was what the committee is required to do under Regulation 13 sub E and 28 sub 2 of the regulations. With regard to ground 5, the committee is of the view that one of the statutory responsibilities of the Electoral Committee is to ensure that the candidate for the position of the President of TLS meets the statutory requirement under Regulation 30 of the regulations. It follows, therefore, that the committee had a statutory obligation to satisfy itself that the candidate met the statutory criteria. Now, in this case, the committee grappled with the question whether or not the committee has been in practice for 10 years as required. The committee was privy to evidence drawn from TLS WAKILI database and Tanzania Advocates Management System that he has not been so, which the advocate Ntobesi admitted to the fact. However, he went on to argue that the nominee paid the full amount of the subscriptions fee later on, thereby atoning his past inactivity. He is of the view that atoned his past inactivity started. He argued, sorry, this one should go, doesn't make sense. He further argued that the payment of fees ratified his client's past failures. The appellant to consider to the payment of fees and in arrears amounting to Tanzanian shillings 1,562,200 shortly before his application for nomination. The Appeals Committee rejects this argument and opposes the funding of the Electoral Committee. The purpose of Regulation 13F of the regulation is to ensure that a candidate must have been active consecutively in practice for past 10 years. It is not the purpose of that regulation that one can be inactive for 9 years only to pay the subscription of the said 9 years in one swoop and then acquire status of active in practice for the past 10 years. This proposition finds no justification at all. The phrase practicing as an advocate under Regulation 13F of the regulation means active in practice as opposed to an advocate on the role of advocates, even if one is not active in practice. It is worth to observe that one can remain an advocate on the role of advocates without practicing. Such person cannot qualify under Regulation 13F of regulations to run for the post of president of TLS. This ground even fails. A list from the state attorneys similarly reflected nothing in that regard to satisfy the nominee's assertion. With regard to the sixth ground, Counsel Ntobesi submitted that the nominee is a member of good standing and that he has renewed his practicing license and has never been suspended or convicted. This committee agrees with the nominee's advocate, but this does not remove the fact that he has not been in practice for the past 10 years as required under Regulation 13F of the regulations. None as part of the committee contests the good standing record of Counsel Nkuba. The Appeals Committee cannot therefore follow the decision of the Electoral Committee and the reason why the payments were made in arrears to indicate the inactiveness. For the above stated reason, the Electoral Appeal Committee upholds the decision of the Electoral Committee, and it is so decided, and right for further recourse is open to Counsel Nkuba. Issued this 6th day of April 2023, and it is ordered.
Kwa elimu hizi na mengine mengi, usisahau kutembelea katika kurasa zetu za Facebook, Twitter, Instagram pamoja na YouTube channel. Wakili TV, kitovu cha sheria.